In the Ozark highlands of northern Arkansas, a limestone cave holds the remains of more than 50 extinct and vanished species, sealed inside sediment layers stretching back over 20,000 years. Researchers called it Peckery Cave, after the thousands of bones from an animal that no longer exists anywhere on the continent. But this was never one dramatic event frozen in time. It was a layered record of an entire changing Ice Age world, written one accident at a time. And 15 miles away, another cave holds a strikingly similar story, telling it entirely on its own. Tucked into the karst limestone hills of Newton County, Arkansas, deep in the heart of the Ozarks, sits a cave that would eventually give researchers one of the richest windows into Ice Age North America anywhere on the continent. It was first excavated in the 1960s, and a follow-up expedition returned decades later, in the early 1990s, to prospect the site further and see what else the sediment was still holding on to. What they found, layer after layer, was a fossil record considerably larger and considerably stranger than anyone expected walking in. Today, this site is known simply as Peckery Cave, and the name itself tells you exactly where to start. The flat-headed peccary, known to science as Platygonus compressus, was a pig-like mammal that once roamed across a significant portion of Ice Age North America. It looked, in general shape, something like a modern wild boar, but it belonged to an entirely different branch of the animal family tree, one that vanished from this continent completely roughly 11,000 years ago, along with so many of the other large mammals that once defined the American landscape during the final stretch of the last Ice Age. Here is the number that gives this cave its name, and it is worth sitting with directly before moving any further. Excavators eventually recovered more than 4,000 individual peccary specimens from inside this single cave. 4,000. And once researchers sorted through that material carefully, they determined those specimens represented a minimum of 64 separate animals. Think about what that actually means laid out plainly. This was not one unfortunate peccary that wandered somewhere it shouldn't have and met an unlucky end alone. This was one of the densest concentrations of this specific extinct species ever documented anywhere in the fossil record. 64 individual animals worth of bone, sitting together inside the exact same cave system. That raises an obvious question before we go any further, and it is worth asking directly, the same way any careful investigation would. Why would 64 separate peccaries, animals that as far as researchers can tell were not naturally inclined to gather inside dark underground cave systems in the first place, end up buried together in the exact same location? The instinctive assumption might be a den, somewhere sheltered, somewhere these animals return to again and again, the same basic pattern researchers have documented at other Ice Age cave sites involving predators using a chamber as a home base for raising young or resting between hunts. That is not what happened here, and understanding exactly why it is not what happened turns out to matter considerably more than the raw number of bones alone ever could. Peccaries as a species were not cave-dwelling animals. They did not shelter underground the way certain predators did. Whatever brought 64 individual peccaries into this exact cave, across what researchers now understand was a considerable stretch of time rather than one single event, was not deliberate animal behavior at all. It was something else entirely, something considerably more accidental, and in its own way, considerably more interesting to actually piece together. Because once researchers moved past the assumption of a den, and started looking instead at exactly how the bones themselves were positioned, how they were preserved, and what specific geological features surrounded the cave entrance itself, a very different picture began to take shape. Not a single dramatic event, not one specific day when disaster struck an entire herd all at once. Something considerably more patient than that, playing out gradually, animal by animal, across an almost unimaginable stretch of time. And once that pattern became clear, it did not just explain the peccaries themselves. It opened up an explanation for essentially everything else researchers would go on to find buried in those same layers of sediment, stretching back far beyond a single species into an entire vanished ecosystem. Nobody had any reason to expect a single Arkansas cave could actually preserve this completely. So if the peccaries were not living inside this cave deliberately, and they were not sheltering there the way a denning predator might, How did 64 individual animals actually end up trapped together inside the exact same underground chamber? Researchers ruled out the den explanation directly, based on the physical evidence itself. Peccaries as a species simply were not cave-dwelling animals to begin with, and nothing about the specific positioning or condition of the recovered bones matched the pattern you would expect from an animal actually using this space as a home base over time. What the evidence pointed toward instead was something considerably more accidental, and considerably more ordinary, once you actually understand the physical landscape surrounding the cave entrance itself. The most likely explanation researchers settled on is that these animals simply fell into the cave. Picture the terrain directly. A karst limestone landscape riddled with sinkholes and hidden openings in the ground, the kind of terrain where solid-looking ground can conceal a genuine drop only a few careless steps away. An animal moving across that landscape, especially at night or during poor weather, or simply following familiar terrain that had shifted slightly since the last time it passed through, could easily have stumbled directly into an opening it never saw coming, with no way back out once it landed. Alongside that direct explanation sits a second, equally plausible one. A nearby creek, running close to the cave entrance itself, that periodically flooded during heavy rain or seasonal runoff. When that flooding occurred, it would have carried loose sediment, debris, and unfortunately, whatever animal remains happened to be sitting nearby, directly down into the cave system below, depositing that material gradually, flood event after flood event, stretched out across an enormous span of time rather than arriving all at once. Neither of these processes required drama. Neither required a single catastrophic afternoon that wiped out an entire herd in one terrible instant. They simply required an ordinary landscape feature, a hidden opening in karst limestone sitting near a creek prone to periodic flooding, doing exactly what that kind of terrain does over and over, animal by animal, across thousands of years. But peccaries were not the only creatures ending up inside that cave, and not every animal getting deposited there was arriving the same way. Researchers identified a third delivery mechanism entirely, and it involves an animal that never actually entered the cave itself at all. Birds of prey, roosting in trees directly overhanging the cave's entrance, hunting smaller animals across the surrounding landscape the same way birds of prey have always hunted, then either dropping partially consumed remains or defecating undigested bone fragments directly down into the opening below them as they perched. Think about what that actually means for the smaller specimens researchers eventually recovered from the site. Rodents, small mammals, the kinds of creatures too modest in size to fall victim to a simple accidental tumble into a sinkhole, but exactly the kind of prey a hunting owl or hawk would have carried back to a familiar perch, again and again, across countless individual hunting seasons stretched over generations. None of these three processes, animals falling in directly, flooding carrying material down from the creek, or birds of prey depositing remains from directly overhead, required anything unusual happening even once. They simply required an ordinary landscape feature sitting in exactly the wrong place for exactly the right amount of time, to gradually become both an accidental trap and an accidental archive at the very same time. And that distinction matters enormously for how seriously researchers can actually treat everything else this cave eventually revealed. Because the sheer range of species that ended up preserved inside those same sediment layers once properly cataloged would end up telling researchers considerably more about Ice Age Arkansas than the peccaries alone, however remarkable in number, could ever have managed entirely on their own. Once researchers finished cataloging everything recovered from Peckery Cave, the final species count came out to a genuinely remarkable number. At least 51 separate species of mammals, all preserved together inside the same layered sediment, spanning an enormous stretch of Ice Age time. Start with the animals most people would actually recognize as belonging to a true Ice Age landscape, the genuine giants. Mammoth remains, direct physical evidence that these massive elephant relatives once moved through exactly this stretch of the Ozarks. Mastodon, a separate and equally massive species, also recovered from the same layers. An ancient form of bison known as Bison antiquus, considerably larger than the modern bison that still roam parts of North America today. Stag moose, an extinct species combining features researchers still debate the exact classification of. A helmeted musk ox, an animal built for genuinely harsh, cold conditions. Tapir remains, evidence of an animal now found almost exclusively in tropical regions, once living instead in what is now northern Arkansas. A species of giant armadillo, considerably larger than anything currently living anywhere on the continent. And dire wolf, one of the most recognizable Ice Age predators in the entire fossil record. Every one of those species shares the exact same basic status today: extinct. Gone from this continent entirely for well over 10,000 years, known to modern science only through exactly this kind of preserved fossil evidence. But the genuinely strange category, the one that tells researchers the most about what this landscape actually looked like during the Ice Age, is not the extinct giants at all. It is what scientists call extraliminal species. Here's what that term actually means in plain terms. These are animals that absolutely still exist today, alive and well, somewhere on the planet. They are not extinct in any sense. They simply no longer live anywhere near this specific region anymore, despite once thriving here directly. Grizzly bear, pine marten, porcupine, heather vole, alongside a wider range of other cold-adapted rodents and small mammals, all of them carrying what researchers describe as clear northern affinities, the kind of species you would expect to find much further north, in considerably colder terrain, rather than in the modern-day Arkansas Ozarks. Think about how strange that actually sounds laid out plainly. A grizzly bear living in Arkansas feels almost like a contradiction the moment you say it out loud today. Grizzlies belong, in the modern imagination, to the Rocky Mountains, to Alaska, to genuinely remote northern wilderness, not to the gentle, forested hill country of the American South. And that contradiction is exactly the point. It is not a mistake in the fossil record. It is a direct signature, preserved in bone, of a climate considerably colder than anything this specific region experiences now, cold enough that species we now associate exclusively with the far north were, at that specific point in time, perfectly at home in what is today the Arkansas Ozarks. Alongside those cold-adapted ghosts of a vanished climate, the cave also preserved something equally important for understanding exactly how much this landscape eventually changed. Animals still perfectly familiar today, still living in these exact hills right now. Beaver, otter, muskrat, raccoon, coyote, gray fox, deer, either mule deer or white-tailed deer. Researchers have found it difficult to determine with full certainty from the recovered remains alone. That combination, extinct Ice Age giants, displaced cold climate species now found only far to the north, and ordinary animals still living in these same hills today, all preserved together inside the same cave, tells you something essential about what this site actually represents. This was never simply a frozen snapshot of one single Ice Age moment, captured once and preserved unchanged. It was a record spanning real, measurable ecological change over time, layer by careful layer, exactly the kind of gradual transformation a truly patient excavation is built to actually read. Here is the number that anchors the entire timeline of this site. The lowest, oldest layer of sediment inside Peckery Cave contains fossils dating back more than 22,000 calendar years before present. Let that number actually settle for a moment, because it deserves real attention before moving any further. 22,000 years places the very bottom of this cave's record deep inside the last Ice Age itself, well before human civilization as we understand it existed anywhere on the planet, during a period most people have only the vaguest possible sense of. Understanding exactly what that specific window represents requires understanding something about how the Ice Age itself actually unfolded, because it was never one single unbroken stretch of unchanging cold. The oldest layer at Peckery Cave captures a period that includes what researchers describe as a weak interstadial, essentially a brief, modest warming pause, followed almost immediately afterward by the onset of the following glacial maximum, one of the coldest, harshest stretches of the entire Ice Age across all of North America. Think about what that transition would have actually looked like on the ground, in real terms, for the animals living through it. a landscape that had briefly, modestly warmed, beginning to cool again rapidly, sliding directly into the single harshest climate phase the entire region would experience for thousands of years afterward. The specific environment preserved in that oldest layer reflects exactly that transitional moment. Mixed Ice Age woodlands made up of spruce, pine, and hardwood forest, interspersed directly with open prairie grassland. An environment that does not resemble anything currently found anywhere in the modern Ozarks. Today's forests in this exact region look considerably different, shaped by a climate that has warmed and stabilized dramatically since that specific window closed. But here's the detail that genuinely elevates Peckery Cave beyond simply being an old fossil site into something considerably more scientifically valuable. Researchers have identified multiple distinct climate phases layered directly on top of each other inside this single cave. This is not a site recording one Ice Age moment, captured once and then left undisturbed. It is recording several distinct phases, stacked in careful chronological order, like pages inside a book that had simply never been opened, sitting undisturbed for roughly 20,000 years, waiting for someone with the patience to actually read it properly, layer by careful layer. And the animals themselves shifted directly alongside those climate phases, exactly the way the underlying sediment record predicted they should, if the site was genuinely preserving real, accurate environmental change rather than some kind of jumbled, randomly mixed deposit. That specific kind of internal consistency matters enormously for how seriously researchers can actually treat a site like this one. If the climate record shows a colder phase, and the exact same layer also happens to contain cold-adapted species like grizzly bear or pine marten, and a warmer phase shows a corresponding shift toward different, more temperate species instead, that alignment is not simply a convenient coincidence. It is precisely the kind of corroborating evidence that gives an entire fossil site real scientific weight, the layered stratigraphy and the layered biology independently confirming each other, rather than researchers simply taking one single interpretation entirely on faith. Think about what that actually means for anyone trying to understand Ice Age Arkansas as a whole, rather than simply cataloging an interesting list of extinct animals in isolation. This cave is not just telling you which species happen to live here at some vague point in the distant past. It is telling you, with real specificity, exactly how this landscape itself transformed over roughly 20,000 years, phase by phase, climate shift by climate shift, and precisely which animals thrived, struggled, or eventually vanished entirely, as each one of those transitions actually unfolded on the ground. And Peckery Cave, remarkable as that record already is entirely on its own, does not actually stand alone in telling this specific story. Just a short distance away, sitting inside the exact same broader stretch of Ozark limestone, another cave entirely was quietly preserving a strikingly similar record of its own. Roughly 15 miles south of the town of Harrison, Arkansas, sitting inside the same broader region surrounding the Buffalo National River, lies a separate sinkhole cave known as the Conard Fissure. This is not simply a nearby curiosity worth a brief mention in passing. This is a second, independently documented Ice Age fossil site, sitting inside the exact same stretch of Ozark karst limestone that produced Peckery Cave itself, and its own excavation history reaches back considerably further in time. The Conard Fissure was originally excavated in 1903, and again the following year in 1904, by paleontologist Barnum Brown. During those two field seasons, Brown's team recovered a genuinely staggering amount of material, no fewer than 15 separate specimens belonging to saber-toothed cats alone, alongside remains of several other big cat species, bears, peccaries, and giant armadillos, all told. Hundreds of pounds of fossil bone eventually transported back to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City for cleaning, cataloging, and long-term study. Think about the sheer scale of what a single sinkhole cave produced more than a century ago, using excavation methods considerably less refined than anything researchers would later apply at Peckery Cave itself. 15 individual saber-toothed cats, recovered from one location, is not a modest find by any reasonable standard. It represents one of the richest concentrations of that specific iconic Ice Age predator ever documented anywhere in North America. But here's the detail that turns these two separate cave sites from simply two interesting, unconnected discoveries into something considerably more significant when considered together. A direct historical thread actually connects them. Paleontologist James Quinn, who worked on follow-up excavations at the Conard Fissure years after Brown's original work there, was the very same researcher who went on to excavate Peckery Cave itself. The same scientist, working the same broader stretch of Ozark limestone, applying what he had already learned at one site directly to his work at the other. That connection matters for more than simple historical trivia. It means two separate cave systems, excavated in some cases by the very same researcher, ended up independently preserving evidence of the exact same vanished Ice Age ecosystem across the exact same stretch of northern Arkansas highlands, each one confirming and reinforcing what the other was already quietly recording in its own sealed layers of sediment. Consider what that kind of independent confirmation actually does for how seriously researchers can treat either site individually. A single unusual fossil cave, however remarkable its contents, always carries at least some risk of being a genuine outlier, an unusual local anomaly rather than a true reflection of the broader regional ecosystem. Two separate cave systems, excavated independently, producing strikingly similar evidence of the exact same vanished animals living across the exact same stretch of landscape, is considerably harder to dismiss as simple coincidence. Taken together, these two sites turn what might otherwise be treated as one unusual cave into something considerably more significant, a genuinely documented regional pattern repeated across multiple independent locations rather than isolated to a single lucky discovery. And that regional pattern extends directly to the timeline itself. Researchers studying this broader stretch of the Ozark Highlands now believe animals were actively using these karst caves and limestone bluff shelters as recently as 20,000 years ago, a figure that lines up remarkably closely with the deepest, oldest layers already documented directly at Peckery Cave. That alignment between two independently excavated sites, separated by roughly 15 miles of Ozark terrain, but pointing towards strikingly similar timelines and strikingly similar vanished ecosystems, is exactly the kind of corroborating evidence that gives this entire regional picture real scientific weight. Not one remarkable cave standing entirely alone asking to be taken on faith. Two separate, independently documented windows into the same vanished world, each one quietly confirming what the other had already been recording in the dark, undisturbed, for roughly 20,000 years. What Peckery Cave has already firmly established is genuinely remarkable in its own right. A richly layered fossil record spanning multiple distinct Ice Age climate phases, preserved by nothing more dramatic or complicated than an ordinary accident of geology and geography, repeated patiently over thousands of years. No single catastrophic event created this site. No sudden disaster sealed it away in one dramatic afternoon. Simple, ordinary processes, animals falling into hidden sinkholes, a nearby creek periodically flooding, birds of prey dropping remains from overhanging branches, all repeated quietly, again and again, until an entire vanished ecosystem had been accidentally preserved in careful, readable order. But it is worth being honest here about exactly what still remains genuinely open for continued research, because pretending this entire story is fully settled would not do the site justice. The precise timing separating each distinct climate phase inside the cave is still actively being refined. Researchers continue working carefully to determine exactly how the different depositional layers relate to one another across the site's full 20,000-year span, a task considerably more complicated than it might initially sound, given how gradually and unevenly this kind of layered sediment actually builds up over such an enormous stretch of time. There is also a wider regional question this entire site raises, one worth stating plainly rather than dramatically. Peckery Cave and the Conard Fissure both sit inside a considerably broader pattern of Ozark karst caves and limestone bluff shelters scattered across the Buffalo National River region, and many of those additional sites preserve their own trace fossils worth serious attention. Den hollows clawed directly into old cave floors, claw marks scraped into limestone walls, hoofprints, slides, and rub marks left behind by animals moving through these same passages, long before any human researcher ever set foot inside them. Researchers are still working through that wider body of evidence today, site by site, patiently piecing together a fuller regional picture that no single excavation, however remarkable, could ever hope to complete entirely on its own. Think about what that actually means for how this entire story should genuinely be understood. This was never a single dramatic reveal, arriving all at once, that neatly closed the book on Ice Age Arkansas for good. It is one part of several ongoing, genuinely patient excavations spread across the same broader karst landscape, each one adding its own careful layer to a regional record that researchers are still actively piecing together, even now, decades after the very first bones were originally pulled out of the ground. That patient, ongoing quality is not a weakness in this story. If anything, it is exactly what makes the whole picture genuinely trustworthy rather than simply convenient. A single spectacular find, arriving once and never independently confirmed anywhere else, would always carry a reasonable degree of doubt attached to it. A regional pattern, built slowly and carefully across multiple independent sites, multiple separate excavations, and in some cases the very same researchers working across decades of their own careers, is considerably harder to dismiss as coincidence or convenient interpretation. A cave named for a pig that nobody alive today has ever actually seen turned out to be holding the memory of an entire vanished world, preserved one accidental layer at a time, across roughly 20,000 years of undisturbed Ozark limestone. Grizzly bears once lived here. Mammoths and giant armadillos shared the exact same forest at the exact same moment in time. A climate that shifted dramatically, and an entire ecosystem of animals that shifted directly alongside it, layer by careful layer, exactly the way the sediment itself still records today for anyone patient enough to actually read it properly. 15 miles away, a second cave tells that same essential story, entirely on its own, confirming quietly what Peckery Cave had already been recording in the dark the whole time. And together, both sites are still being read today, carefully, one excavation season at a time, by researchers who understand that a discovery this old deserves considerably more patience than a single dramatic headline could ever properly give it. Peckery Cave was never one dramatic discovery frozen in a single moment. It was an accident of geology, repeated patiently over 20,000 years, that happened to preserve a changing world nobody was there to record any other way. Grizzly bears in the Ozarks, mammoths and giant armadillos sharing the same forest, a climate that shifted, and animals that shifted with it, layer by careful layer. 15 miles away, another cave tells the same story independently. Together, they're still being read today, one careful excavation at a time. Subscribe for the next investigation.